further side of the river, however, thought it was better for them to resist. They were nearer to the Roman territories and consequently somewhat more under Roman influence. They feared the resentment of the Romans if they should, even passively, render any cooperation to Hannibal in his designs. And as they had the broad and rapid river between them and their enemy, they thought there was a reasonable prospect that with its aid they could exclude him from their territories altogether. Thus it happened that when Hannibal came to the stream, the people on one side were all eager to promote, while those on the other were determined to prevent his passage, both parties being animated by the same desire to free their country from such a pest as the presence of an army of 90,000 men. So that Hannibal stood at last upon the banks of the river, with the people on his side of the stream, waiting and ready to furnish all the boats and vessels that they could command, and to render every aid in their power in the embarkation, while those on the other were drawn up in battle array, rank behind rank, glittering with weapons, marshalled so as to guard every place of landing, and lining with pikes the whole extent of the shore, while the peaks of their tents, in vast numbers with banners among them floating in the air, were to be seen in the distance behind them. All this time the 300 horsemen which Cornelius had dispatched were slowly and cautiously making their way up the river from the Roman encampment below. After contemplating the scene presented to his view at the river for some time in silence, Hannibal commenced his preparations for crossing the stream. He collected first all the boats of every kind which could be obtained among the Gauls who lived along the bank of the river. These, however, only served for a beginning, and so he next got together all the workmen and all the tools which the country could furnish for several miles around, and went to work constructing more. The Gauls of that region had a custom of making boats of the trunks of large trees. The tree, being felled and cut to the proper length, was hollowed out with hatchets and adzes, and then, being turned bottom upward, the outside was shaped in such a manner as to make it glide easily through the water. So convenient is this mode of making boats that it is practiced in cases where sufficiently large trees are found to the present day. Such boats are now called canoes. There were plenty of large trees on the banks of the Rhone. Hannibal's soldiers watched the Gauls at their work in making boats of them until they learned the art themselves. Some first assisted their new allies in the easier portions of the operation, and then began to fell large trees and make the boats themselves. Others, who had less skill or more impetuosity, chose not to wait for the slow process of hollowing the wood, and they accordingly would fell the trees upon the shore, cut the trunks of equal lengths, place them side by side in the water, and bolt or bind them together so as to form a raft. The form and fashion of their craft was of no consequence, they said, as it was for one passage only. Anything would answer, if it would only float and bear its burden over. In the meantime, the enemy upon the opposite shore looked on, but they could do nothing to impede these operations. If they had had artillery such as is in use at the present day, they could have fired across the river and have blown the boats and rafts to pieces with balls and shells as fast as the Gauls and Carthaginians could build them. In fact, the workmen could not have built them under such a cannonading. But the enemy in this case had nothing but spears and arrows and stones to be thrown either by the hand or by engines far too weak to send them with any effect across such a stream. They had to look on quietly, therefore, and allow these great and formidable preparations for an attack upon them to go on without interruption. Their only hope was to overwhelm the army with their missiles and prevent their landing when they should reach the bank at last in their attempt to cross the stream. If an army is crossing a river without any enemy to oppose them, a moderate number of boats will serve, as a part of the army can be transported at a time and the whole gradually transferred from one bank to the other by repeated trips of the same conveyances. But when there is an enemy to encounter at the landing, it is necessary to provide the means of carrying over a very large force at a time, for if a small division were to go over first alone, it would only throw itself weak and defenseless into the hands of the enemy. Hannibal therefore waited until he had boats, rafts and floats enough constructed to carry over a force altogether sufficiently numerous and powerful to attack the enemy with a prospect of success. The Romans, as we have already remarked, say that Hannibal's was cunning. He certainly was not disposed, like Alexander, to trust in his battles to simple superiority of bravery and force, but was always contriving some stratagem to increase the chances of victory. He did so in this case. He kept up for many days a prodigious parade and bustle of building boats and rafts in sight of his enemy, as if his sole reliance was on the multitude of men that he could pour across the river at a single transportation, and thus kept their attention closely riveted upon these preparations. All this time, however, he had another plan in course of execution. He had sent a strong body of troops secretly up the river, with orders to make their way stealthily through the forests and cross the stream some few miles above. This force was intended to move back from the river as soon as it should cross the stream and come down upon the enemy in the rear, so as to attack and harass them there at the same time that Hannibal was crossing with the main body of the army. If they succeeded in crossing the river safely, they were to build a fire in the woods on the other side in order that the column of smoke which should ascend from it might serve as a signal of their success to Hannibal. This detachment was commanded by an officer named Hanno, of course a very different man from Hannibal's great enemy of that name in Carthage. Hanno set out in the night, moving back from the river, in commencing his march so as to be entirely out of sight from the gulls on the other side. He had some guides belonging to the country who promised to show him a convenient place for crossing. The party went up the river about 25 miles. Here they found a place where the water spread to a greater width and where the current was less rapid and the water not so deep. They got to this place in silence and secrecy, their enemies below not having suspected any such design. As they had therefore nobody to oppose them, they could cross much more easily than the main army below. They made some rafts for carrying over those of the men that could not swim, and such munitions of war as would be injured by the wet. The rest of the men waded till they reached the channel and then swam, supporting themselves in part by their bucklers which they had placed beneath their bodies in the water. Thus they all crossed in safety. They paused a day to dry their clothes and to rest, and then moved cautiously down the river until they were near enough to Hannibal's position to allow their signal to be seen. The fire was then built, and they gazed with exultation upon the column of smoke which ascended from it high into the air. Hannibal saw the signal and now immediately prepared to cross with his army. The horsemen embarked in boats, holding their horses by lines, with a view of leading them into the water so that they might swim in company with the boats. Other horses, bridled and accoutred, were put into a large flat-bottomed boats to be taken across dry, in order that they might be all ready for service at the instant of landing.